science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Happy New Year, it's 2022, and as we begin yet another circle around our local star called the sun, and as we enter into the third year into the pandemic, I am beginning this year's conversation with my old friend Mark Jarzombek, who recently presented a lecture in the Humanities, Histories and Futures series here at the University of Washington entitled Future Visions, Dislocations. He was responding to a series of lectures that we are hosting here on the question of the climate crisis, of the environmental crisis. And his response was to slow down, to think about it a little more carefully before we jump to conclusions. As usual in all my conversations with Mark, this conversation produced unexpected results and ever more agendas about things we should be doing together. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Here we go.
So, hi, Mark. Always a pleasure to have you back on Architecture Talk to continue our ongoing conversation. I think at some point somebody should string all our conversations together one after the other and see what kind of glibbity-goo it creates. That could be a lot of fun. But maybe it will be an archivist job someday. But today I thought, we should follow up your recent lecture. You spoke in pandemic times over Zoom with fantastic attendance. We had over 200 people registered, 110, 15 people showed up. One of our more populated talks for this year. And you presented on your interpretation and reading of our ambitious title here at the University of Washington, Humanities, History and Futures lecture series, which we are calling Future Visions, intending to interrogate the Anthropocene and the environmental crisis. And our objective of this series was, of course, to shed theoretical, intellectual, history theory light onto an issue that has been dominated by the technosphere. So that is what you did. You raised some really good flags and talked about it. And if you don't mind, I will do a caricature of your message so that you can tell me no, that's not what I was saying.
Fair enough.
My caricature of what you were saying was that the idea of future visions is already pre-embedded in a kind of a modernist ethos, which reposits faith in persistent human ability to produce fixes or solutions to any problem, and that is a sort of a solution-based outcome thinking, which is part of our problem, which has produced the problem that we are in, and that if we take a moment, if we slow down and take it easy and not, yes, it's a crisis, but it's an ongoing crisis. But then, instead of jumping to what is the next best future vision that you can come up with, what is the latest, greatest, which is kind of Hollywood's business, perhaps we as architects, as architectural thinkers, as concerned environmental people, should pause and see, is it not precisely the kind of technology-based solution making that has landed us in this problem? And with that cautionary lens, slow down, basically. Slow down, take it easy, look around, and see what other modalities there might be to think about this question. How does that caricature sound?
That's pretty good. Pretty good. I mean, now that you mention it, I mean, I would say that I think it's sort of now that I hear you speak, I probably and I probably blurred it in my talk a little bit, but I would say there are three things that we have to be careful of. One is the technocentric solution, which is largely sustainability. Mm-hmm. Then there's a type of what I had nicknamed heavenismo, which is a type of sort of a glorious aesthetic future, the moon base project, from NASA and SOM, where we don't have to worry about the here and now, because we're going to eventually figure it out, right? Sort of in some Star Trek world, we're all going to happen together.
Yeah, jam tomorrow, yes. Yeah.
Right. So all the social issues and this and that, we'll just leave that to whatever, and we're going to sort of imagine this other place.
Right.
And this is the trap of monotheism.
Right.
And then the third is, as you mentioned, from Hollywood, which is future porn, which is a type of rush to come up with the biggest and best and most glorious disasters that we can possibly imagine. So these are three powerful lures, I would say. And modus operandi that can easily confuse us when we, as our humble little architects and our theorists, they're like, well, how can we compete against any of that?
Right.
It's pretty hard, right? So that's the first step, is to sort of identify these modalities, and locate them so that we don't fall into, these types of traps.
Right. So these are difficulties, but it's still, a bit unclear to me. Perhaps you can talk a little bit more. That you're talking about slowing down.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you mentioned thick description, Clifford Geertz, and things. I don't know if you did, but it seems to me, that's the kind of thinking you're talking about. And I want you to push you a little bit more on an elaboration of what slowing down looks like. And I want to do that by referencing, what one of the people that I know both of us are reading, a lot of people are reading, are people like Donna Haraway and Anna Singh and that sort of group. And the concept of staying with the trouble, right?
Yeah. Yes.
They are talking about, don't just rush to technologize or theorize your way out of the trouble. Perhaps the more important thing is to stay with the trouble. Would you be sympathetic to that? How would you nuance your thinking around that?
Absolutely. That's, very much, I think, the title of her book, and I think it's very much a very, a wonderful title, because we don't stay long enough in our architectural schools with the trouble, and we want to sort of design our way out of it in a way, rather than design our way into the trouble.
Right.
And and I think that's a different way of understanding how design works. So we have to accept, that's why, which we have to accept, the subtitle that I added was, complexity and ambiguity. And so we have to just sort of say, listen, it's really complicated or complex, and we have to sort of not try to solve that complexity.
Right.
There's so many different points and so many different perspectives and so many different rights and wrongs. There just won't be any more the one right and the one wrong universally. And that just means we have to relax from certain types of assumptions and certain types of accusatory modalities as well, I'm
Right.
saying as as a liberal, where we would like to sort of identify, all that's sometimes wrong in the world, from the point of view of the right wing or something like that.
Yeah.
Which I approve of course, but I'm saying that we also need to, assume that that's not going to help as such.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
We also got to know ourselves better as well,
Yeah. Yeah.
and not just target those who don't think like us in a way.
Correct. No, I think two or three good points over there. I think, which is that while a broad leftist critique is on the money, the classic leftist Marxist position seems to assume that there is still heavenismo around the corner if only we could topple the corporations.
That's right.
And that we know what to do it. It's just the baddies who are not letting us do it.
Mhm.
And I think your point is good, that while that is true, we also have to take stock of the fact that this is a civilizational problem, in the sense that of a modernity, modernism problem in general. And there is nobody not in modernism or the modern, whatever you want to call it, in globalization today, by and large, or certainly not. We are not. So the stock taking of thinking our way out of this is got to be a much broader project, right? But it seems to me there are two vectors to this. One is that we got to slow down. It's going to take more time because it's complicated and uncertain. Slow down, you crazy child. You're much too fast for. It's like Vienna, Billy Joel, right? Slow down. It's going to take more time. But the other is there's no way out, really. You can slow down, speed up, or whatever. We've got to learn to live with this. Where are you on that? On these two?
Well,
things?
there was a way out, because that was the title of your clever proposals, visions.
Yeah.
And so what I see is visions is a way out. But it's not, and that's why I was interested in that sort of the idea of relating visions to oracular understanding. And, oracles don't give you wholesale futures, right? They give you a particular future for a particular moment, for a particular person or a particular city, which is very tactical. Will I live to be 100? Or, what is the best way to cross the ocean, or something like that, right? They're very particular, right? And so that is a way out, is to sort of reduce, if you will, that expectation horizon from these narratives, to a more tactical, particular, stitch-like vision of a future that may
stitch-like. What do you mean stitch-like?
Well, it's just that, you don't see the whole thread. You just see a stitch.
Right.
Of a thread, and you're trying to figure out, well, where does that thread go? After it disappears into fabric.
Right.
And so oracularism is a little bit like that, right? It connects to some larger understanding of what a future might be, but it doesn't ever give that. It just gives you a stitch.
Got it. Yes.
Right. And so I'm saying that's sort of all that we could really aspire to. The world is going to happen. And that's why, people may not agree with me, or you may not, because I think, as we talked before, I am a sort of fatalist about certain things. And I think that if we, and that allows us a certain intimacy with your current world, not that you give up on it, it's just that you're not sucked into the modality of high performance prognostication.
Right.
And oracles, have been traditionally, not high performance prognostication. That all comes with monotheism. Oracles were like, in the future, this king is going to eat a chicken and die. And so the king doesn't eat chicken, and then one day he doesn't realize it, but his wife serves him chicken soup and he dies, because she didn't know, right?
Right.
So it's going to come true, but you don't know when, necessarily, right?
Interesting.
And so, and so I think that is a form of critique. In other words, I'm saying that instead of the classic ideas, you do something, and then you're supposed to develop a critique. I'm saying you should do something and then try to develop this sort of oracular stitch that sort of tests out certain ways of operating.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea of the, I suppose, the way or the path versus the destination. I mean, you get a sense of a path, and there are many possible paths, and you pick a path, but you do it because you can sort of see 10 feet in front of you, and it is kind of promising, and it kind of disappears. But how that microscopic action integrates itself into the macro picture is an algorithm which is indeterminable. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I love that. Yeah, that's a wonderful way to put it. Yeah.
Right. But because that is it's a Hegel kind of a answer, right? I mean, it's a critique, but a rethinking of Hegel in that sense, right? I mean, what is history becomes the question, right?
Now that I have to puzzle on. That little surprising. Well, my first instinct would be, so no, it can't be Hegel.
Yeah, it's the opposite of Hegel. But because Hegel wants to show the continuity between the micro and the macro. And in the modern technological form, you think local, act global. No, act local, think global, act local. That's sort of Hegel.
For Hegel, no matter how local you are, you're sucked into that global, right? Because history is just so much bigger than you.
Yeah.
That no matter what you do, you're just going to become just a cork on whatever historical fraction.
Correct.
And yeah, this is definitely to say, well, that may be true. Who knows? So to speak. But it's sort of also disempowering in a way, right? And so you have to learn how to operate without that superstructure. So one way to operate without that superstructure is to be more, I don't know, it's sort of, I haven't quite figured out what the right way is, but be more determined about, looking under all the rocks and into corners and in that, staying with the problem, so to speak, which is hard work, which is a hard work. And I say that's really hard. Not everybody wants to do that. And not everybody can do it. And I think it's easier for people like you and me, a little bit older people, because we just see more issues and we can have more fun with them. Whereas younger people, they literally just don't know enough yet, right? It's not about, a 25-year-old person just hasn't. What I knew at 25 was like practically nothing. Now, not I don't say I know a lot, but I certainly think as older you get, you learn a bit more, and so you can sort of see connections that might not be there before. And that's hard work, and so that's the hard work, and that hard work is slow work. Because you're not trying to rush, to the conclusion. It's sort of the hard work of basically epistemology of learning,
right?
Yeah. And then the younger work. I'm speaking, and this is all sort of just thinking from what you're saying. The oracle work is easier to do when you're younger, because sometimes you have just an intuitive feeling about certain things. And the thesis projects that I identified, those titles, which are just fabulous titles, because they're just sort of like, what is that? What are they saying? And that's these are sort of the moment of a type of creativity that complements the hard work stuff, which asks for like a different type of creativity.
Mhm, mhm. So, so in this hard work, this different kind of creativity, in a sort of simple way, one would say, oh, well, this is an environmental policy, politics, and way of life question, right? I mean, it's the rethinking the entire ethos of modernism, or modern life, or 19th, 20th century, and it's a very broad problem. And architecture is only a really small subset of this entire thing. That would be one way to read it. And that would be fine. One would say it really requires, high level thinking, and the climate summit is really an important thing.
I'm saying not high level thinking. I'm sort of saying more like footwork thinking.
Mm.
Because when we did the deconstructed house project, I think we both sort of discovered how hard it was to do that.
Mhm,
I mean,
mhm,
and we're accomplished scholars, we should be able to do these things pretty easily,
mhm.
and not only how hard it was to do it, but how impossible ultimately it was to be, if you will, the proper
Mhm.
historian.
No, I got that. But
Right.
where I was, yeah.
So in other words, architecture is the medium by which this idea of hard work becomes sort of visible,
Mhm.
right? It doesn't make you yet necessarily say how to make a better building, but it might.
It might.
And that's the hope, is that it should, in fact, there should be a consequence to that hard work.
Right.
It's about books. It's not about being better historians or publishing, some fact about something or other. One does hope that architects learn something from all of this.
Mhm.
And
But what I'm saying is, does this not imply the end of architecture? I mean, architecture as the discipline as we know it is very deeply embedded in the modernist project from the 19th and the 20th century. As a kind of a professionalism, as a kind of a solution making, as a sort of ethic, professional responsibility, or if we go beyond that and you think of, I don't know, Corbusier or whoever you want to say, as a kind of a very specific instrumentation of the modernist project, which is heavenism, right? Heavenism, right? So if we are, so would you agree that it's the end of the architectural project, along with everything else? We got to rethink architecture itself.
I would say yes, absolutely. Otherwise, what's the point? That's why Future Visions is so dramatic as a way to think about this. I mean, if we just want more of the same, then we just close up shop and teach architecture like we've been teaching. I mean, if we're trying to challenge ourselves, the only way to challenge ourselves is to sort of say there might be very important alternatives to what we're doing.
Right.
And those aren't going to just sort of come, with a big flash that's going to be said, oh yeah, that's it. Otherwise, somebody would have thought about it long before.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's going to come from the slow, dogged unraveling of that monolithic thing of modernism, of modernity problem in this case, but not its complete dismemberment, because it's not the issue, right? It's sort of like it's, maybe like a virus that lives in the body of modernity that cohabits it and ultimately reshapes it.
Yeah.
But first it's got to multiply. First, it's got to do the work of, getting into the body, getting everywhere. Right now it's only like in the fingertip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Anna Singh's example is the Matsutake mushroom, and she talks about this mushroom, and she says the unique thing, it's a highly prized mushroom, but the only thing is it only grows in areas of devastation. So So that's what we have. So yeah, so the critique is kind of an infection in the body of modernism.
Yes.
If you want to, which
Yeah.
might not be a happy metaphor for people nowadays, but
I know. But why not? I mean, I think you're right. I think, the standard, but let's say the standard, critique comes from, in some sense, knowing the answer. I mean, if you're a leftist, capitalism is bad, right?
Right.
So therefore the critique of capitalism means sort of the salvation of labor or something, like,
Mm-hmm.
Now, and all that is fine, but basically you're always assuming that there's a sort of a better thing beyond, right? And it hasn't showed itself yet. I mean, democracy is pretty much going to end probably in the next 5 or 6 years.
Right. Okay.
And we're going to be at the short end of a stick. And and I think there's also a weird desire to see a future where modernity might actually need to be preserved to some degree, so that we don't fall into sort of chaos feudalism and nationalist hegemonies and brutalities. So
Mad Max world.
yeah, I mean, just thinking of what's happening even here in the States or in India or Kyrgyzstan or whatever,
Yeah.
or China. I mean, these are the futures almost everywhere now.
Right.
We shouldn't be in any illusion about that.
So you are arguing for a sort of provisional holding on to the raft of modernism while we kind of,
I think there's a
back ourselves into something new.
Yeah, that's right. To some degree, and I think that to infest modernity rather than to critique it is a way to actually sort of see how it operates.
Mhm.
And maybe in there's some sort of political solutionism can be produced. That is not utopian, but that allows people to, and that's why I thought I was introducing that word global in a way to say people, in other words, if my building or the building that we use, your building, your house, so we used to, if we were to really fully map how many thousands of people were involved in its making, that map would be global. And if we actually saw that map sort of ontologically and say, these are real people invested in this, how did that, and it's sort of weirdly miraculous transformation of architecture. So my house, as I said in the lecture, was made by probably maybe 10 contractors, all of whom were probably relatively local. All the materials were local. But this is not the way the world is anymore. And so we can use architecture as a way to understand our connectivities. It's a bit extremely easy argument. It's just that I'm saying that we should do it actually quite literally. We should actually try to understand what the miner in Mongolia taking the ore out for the steel in your building, what is that relationship between your building and the ore, and between you as the owner of that house and that man or that woman?
Why? What is that going to do?
I don't know. I'm sort of saying, but it expands. That's what I'm saying. The mushroom world it completely said no problem with that, because the mushroom world was saying, of course, this is all, part of fungal intelligence. But we humans just simply do not have that fungal intelligence. We just sort of say it's somewhere on the other side of the world, and they paid him hopefully an honest wage. But anyway, who gives a damn? I got my steel. And I'm saying, if we really want to think about a fungal intelligence, that relationship has consequence.
But I want to push that a little bit more. I mean, what does that do other than index things and produce a huge database of information?
Your brain just explodes. There's just no way humanly to understand that, right? And we get into the post-human problem. right? That Donna Haraway is sort of asking us to sort of think about. And part of it is like it's just impossible for us really to do that, and we have to understand that impossibility and embrace it.
Right.
So I don't know how, but we are creative people.
So we have to embrace it, and you just deposited huge faith in our creativity. So there's a certain optimism in that position, I guess.
Yes, for me, there's definitely an optimism because it's almost a euphoricism.
Euphoricism, euphoria.
If you like euphoriaism. Because it sort of also gets us out of our narrow little, narcissistic little worlds in which we live in, and we could sort of imagine a world of these communications. I mean, the euphoria is only because you can sort of imagine it just barely in the back of your mind what that world would look like, and it was like, wow, at least it's so amazing and so cool. And our world looks pretty black and white and pathetic compared to that.
If I may just shift this slightly, but also return to an earlier point, does the university look very different in this world? I mean, the entire sort of universe of disciplines that we call a university is a modernist product and part of the problem. And we constantly talk about cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinarity, right? As if there is expertise, but we just got to put our heads together and we'll solve it. So put the planners with the architects and the real estate people and the economists, and then you'll get it.
Problem number one, right there. Yeah.
So, but what is the pathway number two? What is a fungal university look like? How would we start working towards that?
Vikram, that's the question. That's a great question. You're now an administrator. You could sort of think how to answer that.
Yeah,
I think that would be great. What would a fungal university look like? I think to some degree, and be maybe just a little bit old-fashioned, but this is not the only thing that would involve, would be traveling. In other words, when we order or steal, let's go to the mines in Mongolia and let's talk to the people and to see how it works. Not that we're going to necessarily change anything, but it will be eye-opening for people. I mean, you can do it by photography or go on YouTube and you can find these things and so forth. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, let's just talk to it, figure out how it is. What is the chain of command? What is the work life look like there? How are these people living? And they have to come, to your site and look at your site and say, okay, this is where my steel is going to go. Oh, that's so cool. And they have to understand your life. And then you have to do that with the wood guy, with the shop guy. I mean, you'd spend maybe 15 years just to build a little house. Right. I mean, it would just change. That's what I meant by slow. It would just change the dynamic of everything if we just started talking to each other across the globe about all these things that are mapped out. So in other words, now everything's mapped out, but it's all in silent treatment. Everything's on mute, like Zoom, who knows how anything works? And it's impossible to actually, even research it because the mute button is on for good. And, so universities don't really help much. Yes, you can find somebody who will give you from the mining department who can tell you a little bit about the mining in Mongolia and write an essay for it in some journal somewhere that no one's going to read because no one knows how to read these things. It's completely useless, except for people in that field. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a very basic expansion of human consciousness through geographies and through materialities. That it's just like impossible unless you just sort of imagine a whole different way of doing architecture, a whole different way of living, a whole different way of expenses. Who's going to pay for their travel and who's going to pay for all that? I don't give a shit. I mean, I'm sort of saying if you can't imagine these things, it doesn't have to be literal, but even by imagining them, all of a sudden that asks certain questions
the one of the other concepts you floated in your lecture was time to degree. I guess to a certain, first we are talking about whether there is such a thing as a degree. You know, are we any longer in a position to authorize certification? If certification just has to become a very narrow technical thing. It's like, we'll teach you structures and we'll teach you exiting, and what else do you really need for certification? Safety, right? And we can do that in 1 year. We move on. But the larger project of architecture, in a sense, also start to undermine the university itself, because we are. What is the certificate anyway? But I'm thinking, this starts to get dangerously close to this sort of techno people here who are saying, I don't know if the university teaches you anything useful. Right?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's true. And I do think that the university has a place in this, and in potentially, to say, leading the argument, because I would say the university environment understands the need to look at things deeply and look at them well.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It also understands the world of creativity. So these are natural, environments within the university.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know about all the other disciplines. I just let all that's a different story. But we do know something about architecture. And if we let the actual buildings on the ground speak, right, rather than us speaking at them, but letting them speak, what do they tell us? Then we realize, my God, they're telling us things that we had no idea, were relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And, so in some sense, the educator is building, what can we learn that the building has to tell us, about that steel, or about the wood, or about the rubber moldings, or whatever it is, they tell us incredible stories. It's just that we've never really listened to them or incorporated them into our structures of history or theory. So, in some sense, it's like, I've always been, and I think you and I agree with this, we're always against a little bit the presentist modalities. But on the other hand, one could argue that we just don't know anything about the present either.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's where the hard work of uncovering all of this takes place. And university would be a first step, but ultimately, maybe at the end, there just is no university anymore, right?
Well, I have a different spin on it, listening to what you are saying. Because if, can imagine somebody in medicine, or I don't know, let's say earth sciences,
Mm-hmm.
would say, yeah, that's what we do. That's what we call research. All day we sit around, sending things down to the bottom of the ocean, and we are trying to research all this, and we are trying to listen to the ocean, or whatever it is, their definition of listen to the ocean via sonography or whatever they use. And teaching is kind of a side job for them, right? I mean, it's like, oh, okay, then you gotta sort of run a few classes and you get the TAs to do it. This is what we class it. But in architecture, we put so much money and so much investment precisely to teaching, because we do a professional education. What I'm hearing you say is that you're starting to outline what research in architecture might really look like. Instead of research being optimization of construction technologies and introducing building information modeling into, better ways to make buildings faster, better, cheaper, research in architecture should be listening to the trees. And we need to develop our own sonographs to be able to talk to the trees. And indeed we need to develop this into, maybe you don't like the word, but maybe into a whole science about what it means to do all this.
Well, I didn't think of it that way, but I think you're very right. I think it definitely, I'm a little worried about some of the aspects of research, because it sort of makes it formalized as opposed to something that is committed to you. But yes, research is, I would say, a part of it. And I went through some of the thesis projects, from the 80s and 90s, which I would say, were sort of like this dull research that we don't want, right? So in other words, I mean, some of them are very good titles. So I got one up here, order and diversity within the modular system for housing. From a squatter settlement, a program to build a city, imagining and reimagining public housing, deployable structures inspired by origami. These are all wonderful things, right? But what I'm talking about and what you're reaffirming through this idea is something, 1,000 times more complicated,
way more difficult
than these little operative professional projects, right? So in other words, if you're right, if we think of, let's say, geoscience, which is sort of an endless pursuit of what is the planet, and you put it here and you put there, and you got the guys under the water and you guys under the atmosphere, Imagine that intensity in architecture, right?
Yes.
Architecture comes off as, this incredibly thin one-dimensional field compared to all of that. And you're right. I would say we need to sort of think in those terms.
Yeah. And to produce people who call that, who make that into a life's work, and whole disciplines and departments. And
no. There I would be a little, because then what we do is we outsource it, to the building technology people, or we outsource it to the computation people, or to the geoscience people. In other words, we have to actually insource it into architecture. We still need to have a place that's called architecture, so that it's not epistemologically outsourced.
No, of course not. But we can, we can get a jump start by cut pasting a lot of the technologies and ways of thinking that have been developed all around.
That's why I say the interdisciplinarity model doesn't work, because what you're trying to do is just sort of hobble all that together. Whereas if I tell a student, okay, in 30 years, I'm going to give you an architecture degree. But in that period, I want you to go to Mongolia. I want you to build in the rainforest. I want you to build in the Sahara. I want you to talk to people in here. I want you to talk there. In other words, I want you to find out how the rubber is actually made. I want you to go to the machinery and to the quarry depots. And you do all that in 30 years, fully funded, then I'll give you an architecture degree. You're going to have a very different person.
True. I was going the other way. I was thinking we should give architecture degrees in 1 year and call them, life safety and exiting and, professional competence degrees. But that faculty
but you
should
need
be
a hook.
expected
you need a hook. Otherwise, they're just going to go off and start building someone's barn in the back of the house.
Yeah. I mean, to build a barn, just go ahead,
But that's really why I think that the idea of visions was also so compelling in the title that you have, because visions is not, you don't give up on visions, right? All that research and all that hard work and all that 30 years of learning and and so forth like that, commitment, doesn't mean that the results have to wait 30 years from now, right? So before you get
there are no results.
Yeah. The result is, if you will, these sort of visions that like, oh wow, I never, let me do that, and so that's why I thought the younger generation has already understood that in a way, right? They've already intuited that thesis titles have to be very different. So, the ones that I got from UW and from, MIT, an architecture of pan-climactic humans. Just brilliant.
Maybe students are starting to intuit that. But what I'm saying is, what are the architectural research books and papers that start to intuit this at the sort of a full professor level? I mean, we need, because this needs multiple lifetimes of work, right? Of a lot of people.
Yeah, that's right.
We're starting, in a sense, a new project of post-human research in architecture is not building information optimization.
No,
It's about building a different relationship to Gaia, to Mother Earth, or Planet Earth, or the universe, or whatever it is, right?
right. And
Uh,
it's not something you can just quote read in a book,
right.
right? So in other words, the guy next to you is building a house, right? Also did some steel. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that person shouldn't say, "Hey, Vikram went to Mongolia. Let me learn from him."
Well, I don't know why you learned something from me. I mean, depends on what
No,
I
I'm
did.
not saying he shouldn't, but I'm sort of saying
Yeah.
that he can't just use that as an excuse to not go, right? So to speak, right?
Yeah, so there's always, but it's an addition to the work, right? I mean, it's
There's an
Yeah.
addition, but also the repetition of it, right? Because he's
Sure.
going to see or she's going to see something different.
Mhm.
There's not like one answer is going to be the right answer, right? That person is going to go and say, Vikram missed this, right? And I'm interested in that, right? So that is like it is the water in a stream, right? Is never the same thing twice. So it can't be just codified into sort of research papers and journal articles and books and publications, right? It always has to remain fresh for that person, right? In order to keep the oracular potential going. Otherwise, it just comes back to, I'm going to make stronger steel for skyscrapers in the 21st century.
No, I mean, I think it's possible to do research and build on each other's research. That is not just about stronger steel. It can be about, talking to trees. Talking to trees can be a whole subdiscipline.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm just sort of saying it doesn't translate necessarily to the other person in the traditional form of research, right? It's a research that is sort of very, not completely personal, but as a strong embodiment within how you're sort of working through the material. But at the end of those 30 years,
there is no end. Yeah, I mean, we can't.
Whatever. I mean, it's not like you necessarily produce an article or a book or something, but you just do it building. And the building will, in some sense, or whatever it is that you're making, a landscape, artwork, you're producing something creative that will be a testament to the types of knowledges that you have developed.
I guess you're more anarchist than my position.
Yes, probably.
Because I do think that we have to reinvent the discipline, and the discipline, other disciplines are reinventing themselves in the face of this, whatever you want to call it, post-human or environmental evidence that is mounted against us, against the modernist project. They are starting to reinvent themselves, and I think that's how we are getting, from my perspective, read new readings of physics, for instance, quantum physics, and certainly, let's say, the work in, environmental studies, transgender studies, certain aspects of anthropology, the whole Donna Haraway kind of a world. Certain disciplines are reinventing themselves with this in mind. But this is really not seeped into architecture. We are still so wedded to the idea of producing solutions, around the corner solutions, and just putting more and more investment in that because the crisis keeps becoming worse. So we sort of put more and more effort into ever greater urgency.
That's right. And the discipline, discipline does that in order to substantiate its existence.
Yeah.
And
I guess what I'm saying is I'm not putting too much faith in, in students going to Mongolia. It doesn't give me too much faith, frankly. I mean, I think it's a good thing, but I really need Mark Jarzombek and Vikram and all the senior, I mean, how do we make a different scholarship, a different way of running the institution, a different way of what we are calling architecture and what we are calling architectural research? What would be a journal that publishes this kind of research. It's not at the JSA, it's not JAE, it's not even Grey Room or whatever it is. It's certainly not Architectural Review or Architectural Digest. I mean, which is that journal? So I feel like it requires.
Well, I would say I agree that it's a journal, but not in journal as we understand them. But perhaps in a journal in the sense that it is a record keeping of the type of intense work that people are doing. Mm-hmm. Like a day journal, rather than a journal like we might understand it academically.
Day journal.
Yeah, okay. So that I can follow the track that someone is taking and say, wow, that I really never thought about that, right? Or I see what that person is trying to get at, or maybe I can say, let me talk to that person. Let me figure what so they're not, the lonely hitchhiker across the planet. Mm-hmm. So there could be a journal that allows people to communicate to each other about their different knowledges, different experiences, and so forth. But it doesn't need to be, let's say, footnoted, right? It's about, what they're learning. It could be footnoted, it could not. I mean, that's just sort of, there's no necessarily, but in that sense, it's a journal. That I could definitely see. And then that would take on a certain density over time.
Yeah.
A brilliant density, that would itself become almost an artwork, right? After, let's say, 30 years, it would be huge in scale, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would call it a discipline, or if not a discipline, if you don't like the word discipline, whatever word we want to say, a living knowledge of our engagement onto epistemic engagement, entanglement with the world.
Yes.
So it's a oracular repository. If let me try and use your.
Yeah.
The oracles had libraries, didn't they?
I don't know.
They must have had some form of.
They knew about the world. They were obviously not ignorant, because otherwise they couldn't have said things.
Right.
So when the Greeks went to Delphi and they said, what are we going to do about the Persians? I mean, the oracle knew damn well that the Persians were there. I mean, they weren't just sort of sitting in their bubble and going, Persians, who are they?
Yeah.
So they had
and they knew. And what I'm talking about is the oracles knew about the other oracles and what that oracle did.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
And some oracles sort of disagreed. I mean, the Athenians went to one oracle and they said one thing. They said, okay, hell with them. Let's go to another oracle.
Yeah, there were schools of oracality.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. It's like, that's what a design thesis can be. Design thesis can be competing oracular visions, right? That just sort of stand there as sort of opportunities to think about a particular future in a particular site in a particular condition and so forth, as defined by the thesis. But that can only happen, once if you guard yourself against, the future porn, and also if you do enough hard work. Most theses today are just done on the thinnest and slimmest of work.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Problem, right? They're just sort of skating on stuff.
Extremely thin ice.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And, it's a wish and a prayer more than an oracle. So that's why I think we need to sort of combine these two efforts and not see them as necessarily antithetical, but they just have different energies.
Correct. Yeah. Well, I feel students don't feel like they can put reposit their entire faith on the modernist edifice. So now they're skating off into whatever directions they can. Those who sort of engage the world, but they're skating pretty much on, like you said, thin ice, or wish and a prayer, and we need to build some density under it and help them build that density.
That's right, and that's why it takes years and not semesters. So the first step would be certainly sort of to say, okay, let's do a 10-year thesis, I think
Well, yeah.
that would
Yeah,
be,
that's called research. I mean, that's you and I are doing 50-year theses, right?
yeah, yes. Right.
I mean, I'm still in school. I don't know about you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for conversation. As always, it's wonderful to talk to you.
It's so great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.